Oh, I got both of you. I thought you were
Yeah,
on.
turns out I'm not on PTO, so.
Okay. Jeremy, I don't need you anymore if you can hear me. I thought I needed somebody to give me some screen sharing powers.
All right, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I got the
which I'll still
notification
take.
that, yeah, I'll do that.
I love this. So many of you.
Right, you should now be able to share your screen.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Confirmed. Confirmed. Did you hear all that, Jeremy? You're redundant.
It appears I'm not needed.
Yeah,
But
thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, no
the
problem.
answer is something I was curious about, which is whether two people could sign in on the SIG Multicluster account at the same time.
Yeah,
works.
it didn't cause a time space
Yeah.
tear.
Even though we could be spread around the world. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible.
I will go back to one lead. All right.
Okay. Yes. Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, great.
I guess we're just waiting for Jack.
Yeah, I think so. Should we maybe
Ping
meet
him.
and greet?
Well, while we
Anyways.
wait, yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I am Laura. Um, I I don't know. Uh,
So hey, I've
I
always wondered, how do you say your last name?
oh, my last name Lorenz.
Lorenz, okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's how I say it at least. I think it was German originally, but we've become diluted over here.
And you're frozen.
Sorry.
Well, for introducing ourselves, my name is Tom, and I work with Steven at Red Hat and Submariner. I've attended some of the SIG calls, much as I can, but more active now.
Yeah. So I'm Stephen. I'm the new co-chair in SIG. I was involved with Laura and Paul and setting up trying to decide between E2E and conformance testing a couple of years ago. And I'm still interested in the conformance testing, but I probably won't be as involved as Tom, I suspect. Or you, John?
Everyone, I'm John Hune. I work at Microsoft with Jack, and I think we're just looking to kind of get involved with testing stuff kind of in general. So yeah, I've been poking around the EDE tests for a little bit, and yeah, looking to try to understand what the conformance tests are all about.
Cool. Can I jump in here again? Sorry, can you hear me all right? All right. Yeah, so I also have been involved with MCS and specifically in its testing environment for a while now. Got reorged a couple times here and there, so kind of like scraggling my way back right now. But yeah, I'm really excited that there's so much interest in this and kind of reinvigorating it. And I think as everybody probably saw and Stephen posted, there's some like docs from the last major iteration of working on this that maybe are out of date, but at least we could kind of coalesce around and decide if those are useful to us working together going forward or not, if we need some sort of new sort of thing. And then I think, yeah, if we can spend some time understanding, what everybody wants to be working on and what, kind of, yeah, just so that we're on the same page about everything, and then I can adjust, for example, like my review time and stuff more effectively than I have in the past. And I think we could also just better determine what we want to work on next. So I would love to basically feel good about how we're communicating with each other, and if any of the prior artifacts from previous, you know, groups working on this are helpful to us, or if we need like a new set of docs or meetups or sub chats or whatever, how we want to communicate with each other. So that's what I would love to get out of today.
My interest. Well, I mean, I could work on anything really, but yeah, end to end. But I guess my interest right now and priority is the conformance testing.
Cool.
So I think Jack mentioned you're more interested in the end to end.
I think the end to end is like a graduation
John.
blocker. Oh,
John,
yeah. Okay, yeah. No, that's fine. Cool. Yeah, I think both of them are really important to us, and I think maybe this is all already well known or discussed before, but the end-to-end tests are like a hard graduation blocker. That's been like a whole thing, but it's also not the best representation of like how people could really use testing to understand if their implementation is conformant, and also just like there are such basic tests, I guess, in terms of like the functionality and features, that we definitely feel that we need a conformance test suite on top of it, but we didn't want to make that like a blocker for graduation. So maybe you all already know that, but that's kind of like also why those are two separate kind of lines and two separate how to say, like, audiences, I guess. So they're very different in that sense. But yeah, we definitely need both of them, is I guess the conclusion.
Well, I haven't had time to look at the end to end.
Sure.
But my I guess my assumption is that it's testing the reference implementation, or is that not correct?
Effectively, yes, and I will comment that the reference implementation is itself like very basic. It's just it was a like super early proof of concept before I even got involved with this. At this point, it's like, I don't know, 4+ years old maybe. Um, but yeah, and I think it's not intended whatsoever to be like a good production example. So in that sense, it's like really truly just a reference. And yeah, I want to emphasize that amongst ourselves in particular, because I think especially with the end to end and with the conformance test, it's valuable to be able to have something that we can build those on top of. But there's also like a lot of work to keep those, in line with the other derivatives that we expect, downstream derivatives that we actually expect people to use. So I think that is like a constant kind of pressure for us in this testing side of things to determine how much we need to add on to, or expand the reference quote unquote implementation, and how much or what features are kind of not like don't need to be there. Hi, Jack.
Hey, thanks again for kicking this off on time, despite me not being here. I have two questions. One, is the
Yeah.
current state of end-to-end coverage sufficient? So are we in a holding pattern waiting for the new changes for V1 Alpha 2? And then the follow-up question is, what would be the downsides of including conformance testing as part of GA?
I'm going to answer the second one first. The downsides are just, I think, time of, or like adding an extra blocker to scope. I think it was expected to do something like that once we determined it was important, but we didn't think that we had, I think, the time, I guess, or the bandwidth to like fully put out a fully featured conformance test for GA. So we didn't want to like artificially block on it, I guess. But yeah, I think that was all more of a, and Stephen, maybe you can put in your 2 cents about that too. But I think if we think that's really important to act as a graduation blocker, we can certainly push for that. But I don't think it was enforced by the community, and so that way it gave us a little bit more wiggle room to have one set of things that were like a hard graduation blocker, and another set of things that were a little bit more fluid and didn't need to get into their like pristine condition before we could move something else along. Stephen, any input there?
Yeah, nothing as far as accuracy is concerned, but my concern really with all that is that ultimately the E2E test stuff that nobody's ever going to use. So, but yes, it's true that that's what's written in the KEP currently is the GA blocker. And so to go back to your first question, Jack, I think that all that's left there is test number 3, which is test cluster A can contact service imported from cluster A and B and route to expected endpoints in both clusters. And the thing is, all 3 tests that are in the KEP are also useful conformance tests. So we're not wasting time by implementing them at E2E as long as they're reusable easily enough in conformance. And
Okay.
yeah, I'm not sure it's useful to block GA on having a conformance suite, but there is well, that's easy to say when we have a group of people right now that are interested in working on E2E and conformance. But looking at the history of the project, if we think the conformance is important, then maybe it's worth making it a GA blocker to ensure that we actually get around to it.
Well, my larger observation is right now, the folks here in this group interested in test coverage as a part of GA have, I guess there's one more scenario to do. So John and I can own that number 3 scenario that you listed. It's probably not that much work. And we have potentially unlocked parallel cycles with the other work going on in MCS API to actually evolve the API to a V1 Alpha 2. So I feel like we're not the lowest hanging fruit in terms of blocking progress at this point. So we could potentially begin conformance tests, but I am curious what we mean by conformance test. Do we mean simply the tests, or do we actually mean integration into Kubernetes as a sort of release gate / signal? Okay, so just the test. It's just like
the test. It's just getting a
Yeah.
report that says, well, it said you get a binary that you run, and it says you run it against
Yeah.
an MCS setup, and it tells you, okay, you're passing this test, that test, and you're failing this other thing, and so on.
Understood. So we essentially just copy the Kubernetes conformance Ginkgo pattern implemented in MCS. So everybody in the Kubernetes ecosystem is familiar with the semantic value of what conformance means, and you can run it against MCS. Great.
Yeah.
That all makes sense. I think that it seems to me there's very little downside in starting that work. So sounds like we want to prioritize getting end-to-end test number 3 as defined in the KEP in place. That's obviously the most important because that's what the community's already determined to be in scope for graduation. But to the extent that there is conformance coverage when we come to the place where we're discussing graduation with the community, it seems like it would only help the case for graduation if conformance was in place. So maybe we don't have to worry about, rescoping the requirements for graduation, but it seems like it would be beneficial to that effort.
Yeah,
if
there's
we had
definitely
cycles to do that.
Yeah, definitely if we have the time, we should do it. So yeah, I don't think there's any like we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do this now or anything
Cool.
at all. So yeah, I think if we have the time and the energy, let's do it, people.
John, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, is number 3? I haven't been in the foxhole with you implementing the end-to-end test so far. Have you been doing sort of exactly what Stephen laid out? Just read the KEP. Here's the scenario, and I just do it. So do you feel like you have everything you need to go do number 3, as we're calling it?
Yeah, I think so. I think I was mostly looking at Laura's comments and the issues in the repo more than because I think those had a little more detail than what the KEP had. So I think I was using those mostly as I was like actually writing them. And I guess when I was reading through the KEP, at least, it seemed like test 3 was also kind of included in test 2, so that might already actually be implemented. I'd have to go back and check to see though.
Yeah, let me double check that I do have some other notes in here too of what test 3 exactly means specifically in this doc. And
Can
yeah,
someone
so I
share
think
that, please? Sorry, I didn't mean to. Someone share that, 'cause I'm not
yes.
sure what you're referring to. Sorry.
Yeah, I just
see it in
put
chat.
it in
my-
the meeting chat, but
Okay.
yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah. So this is a doc about all the blockers in general, but if you if you go to this E2E test exists for MCS services and you scroll down a little bit, there's this table of KEP requirements to reality. I need to update this test 2 situation because things have changed for that since I last updated this doc. But importantly, everything kind of below that includes all these definitions and negotiations about like what exactly those words meant for the purposes of finishing the E2E tests and what we thought was a valuable thing to do in light of the like bandwidth that we had. So there's some like extra stuff in here, extra ideas in here too. But I think, John, if it was helpful the way that I wrote those issues in GitHub that were just like, this is exactly what we want for this test, blah, 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 go forth and prosper, then I can definitely do that for test 3.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that would be super helpful.
Yeah, so I'll just do that to unblock you, and then you don't have to like read all the secret, like coven
Cool.
meeting
Yeah, thanks.
notes. Yeah,
Don't
great.
give them some fun though. I mean, we want to
Yeah,
read
I
some
mean,
coven.
yeah, I'll put some sort of mystery in there that
Hopefully
you
there's
must
some runic
unlock.
content.
Yes, exactly. It will be totally like that. So you have to find that. Otherwise, the demons will spawn. So watch out. Cool. Okay, so that is the E2E test. So I think we have like a super clear path forward for that. Shall we reroute to the conformance test convo? Let
Works for me.
me get that doc handy so everybody knows what we're talking about. And you know what? I asked for screen share powers, so I'm going to use them, people. Even though I apparently have the worst connection here.
So we can see your screen.
All right, well, that's what's important. Okay, so just to back up a little bit, so I make sure that we're all on the same page. The doc I was talking about before for the end-to-end tests is this one. It looks like this: beta blocker status, blah, blah, blah. The section I was talking about was this table, and these were the runic inscription.
Did we lose Laura's audio?
Performance test to do.
Oh. You're back, Laura. You were gone for a wee bit.
Gosh, sorry. Okay, I was just mentioning that this was the doc I was talking about before about end-to-end. This is about conformance tests.
Yeah.
And this is what we're talking about now. Okay, so I think the major thing about the conformance tests for us was that to meaningfully test your implementation, you need to have more than one cluster, right? And so the Kubernetes conformance test infrastructure isn't super made for that. And then we were taking a look at the Gateway API for some inspiration, because their whole thing is about, it's not only about multi-cluster stuff, I guess. But they do have some overlap with us. But when we were looking at this, however, I think now it's probably like a year and a half, 2 years ago, Gateway API's conformance tests were also not a super great drop-in, type of experience. It was also only stuff on one cluster. They had not well tested the multi-cluster situation. There was stuff that, was kind of like hard coded for them that wouldn't be hard coded for us, which, is natural. But it just wasn't, it was better inspiration than the Kubernetes conformance tests themselves, but it was still just short of like the infrastructure we needed for, I need this test to run with 2 clusters. I need this test to run with 3 clusters. I need this test to run with N number of clusters because I'm like some huge big cloud provider and I want to make sure that this still works with 500 clusters or whatever. So that was kind of the first big thing that we started to chew off. The other part that was important was how can, knowing that people are going to basically run this binary and then get some output, what does that output kind of look like so that they can like compare and decide, and how do we need to explain to them what they got wrong, I guess. Like, do we link directly to like a line in the KEP and like the README that's like, yo, this is the definition of what you were supposed to do and you didn't do it, so like read this again? Or is it just like, you failed everything, good luck? We wanted it to be more partial credit, basically, and useful for people to be able to find what was wrong with what happened. So we wanted there to be something more intelligent at the end about, if you failed this test, that means you probably didn't do this, that, or the other thing. That was something we as the standard owners could articulate and guess from how people fail their tests so that we could give them more useful information. So I think those are 2 major things that made this harder than kind of just like copying something that exists from before and making it work. Stephen did a bunch of great work of kind of a first pass of the infrastructure for it, including some of the stuff related to how do we establish like how do we get the credentials for the different clusters that we're supposed to be testing against, and also a little bit of what that output could look like and how we could hook that in. So I think a first, Stephen, unless you disagree, I think a first version for anybody who's interested in this is maybe getting familiar with that framework and like just giving that a try and seeing like how those things connect in, because that was kind of like where we left off last for this. There's one more thing I want to say, which is that there was like a really exciting, beautiful, elegant version of this we all imagined that was like a DSL of like specific to like multi-cluster tests where like in YAML or something you could, or you could like describe tests in a super composable modular way and decide like, am I doing this with 1 cluster, 2 clusters, or 2.5 clusters, or like whatever, which still would be cool, but not harshly required. But just so you get a sense of like when we were talking about this problem in the abstract, we were trying to like come up with ways that you could like kind of combine features of MCS into tests together, because there's lots of stuff that changes. Like, is it that you're exporting from all clusters or just from one or just from a subset of them? Is it that all clusters are accepting incoming connections or they're not all accepting them? Is it that the service is headless or is it non-headless? How, like, what are the expectations that change with that? Is it that there is a local copy of the service for a given cluster and we need to confirm that like that goes in some order, like we ping that first before something else? So like that's the kind of composability that we perceived when we were talking about this in the abstract, that I think doesn't ever go away. Maybe the like cool composable DSL is like doesn't have to be like the only way we do it, but you can maybe get some of the sense of why we were kind of going that direction. Hey, Jack.
We wouldn't want to just use the pattern of exploding the test matrix with a bunch of different scenarios, like you've listed some there, and then have
Yeah,
Ginkgo
I
do the hard
mean,
work, Ginkgo focus, Ginkgo skip. That's
yeah,
how
that was like
that's
the
on
dream.
in Kubernetes.
Yeah,
Like we've got super standard tests, and the Ginkgo input is horrible. There's like this crazy regex, but that's like a normal pattern. From a naive perspective, that might seem horrible, but that is kind of the pattern.
sure. Yeah, and I mean, I think like ultimately, yeah, when we thought about all the potential situations, we have a couple, examples here. It was like this is a like how to say, like a coordinate system. Headless versus non-headless is part of the coordinate system. L4 versus L7 is part of the coordinate system. TCP UDP is a part of the coordinate system. If the local service is there or not is part of the coordinate system. So we're in some sort of like 10-dimensional like geometry here. And yeah, so we were like, cool, it's matrix multiplication. Let's do that. Which, is still true. I think this is part of what like the folks like seriously working on conformance tests have to reckon with, of like how composable is it. And where we left off is we wanted it to be more on the composable side, but it is of course hard. But that is the inspiration. If you take a look at what Steven started working on, you'll see some of that inspiration. So I think that can help seed the path forward if we can all take a look at that and kind of know that this is where, we were coming from.
Cool, that makes sense. Maybe a macro path. Maybe we could just start right away, or after we get test 3 in place, we could start right away on a conformance test that uses the reference implementation as a very simple example, and then just commit post graduation, because the value of this is really going to come when these run on opinionated implementations of MCS, right? Like that's the actual value of a conformance test, is like my implementation.
Yes, it is.
Is conformant. So I think that trying to anticipate that in the abstract is super, super hard. So maybe we just partner with someone in the ecosystem who wants to be conformant, the first conformant provider, so to speak, and we can donate some cycles to work with that volunteer on that effort. John, I think you were first.
Yeah, so I guess one kind of question I've had is, so basically the EDE tests do include like the reference implementation and also some scenarios that also would seem to fit in the conformance side of things. So is that kind of where we would want to get to, is where the EDE tests are essentially just the conformance tests with a reference implementation, and then we can reuse all the same testing stuff with different implementations? Or is there some like boundary in terms of like philosophical scope between like
Mhm.
EDE tests and conformance tests?
I don't think it's philosophical. I think it was um, convenient to separate them so that we could like divide and conquer and not, get in the merge conflicts or wait for the conformance test skeleton to kind of be together to keep making progress towards the E to E's. In our experience, while some of the really inner parts of the E2E seem reusable and conformance, the like definitely the setup and teardown is like so ridiculously different. It's like a complete like waste to each other. I think if there was a future where the reference implementation ran against the conformance suite instead, that would be awesome. But it's so like to me that seems so low compared to like if the conformance test actually helped people become conformant with the MCS API. Like I'm so much more interested in its value to, and I think that's also why we really wanted it to be like so helpful on the output of like, you got this wrong, go fix it. It was very much coming from a perspective of like, we need to make it easier for people to onboard to this standard. It's got a lot of like little moving parts and people are missing like little tiddly bits because it's the human who has to read prose and turn that into like something. Yeah, so that's my take. I think it was just convenient, and then I think that if converging them reduced the benefit of the convergence of the conformance tests to end implementers, then I would be like categorically against it. But if that doesn't have to happen, that's fine. But it just didn't seem very obvious when we were first working on both of them at the same time that they would converge in a way that didn't harm that process for people who are trying to make an implementation. Stephen, you have both a hand and maybe a thought about what I have said.
Yeah, both. Yeah, and what Jack wrote in the chat.
Cool. Love that.
Which is
Do it
very
all.
interesting. So going back to the earlier comment about who's it for. So one of the reasons I got Tom involved, apart from the fact that he's interested in all this and he likes writing integration tests and those sorts of things, is that obviously Submariner has a vested interest in the conformance tests, and so that could be an implementation that wants to be conformant. There are two angles to this. There's figuring out where Submariner isn't conformant with the API and figuring out where making Submariner conformant with the current expectations of the API is too, well, difficult, and maybe it means that we should revisit the API instead. But that's a different question. So I would be fine at least with looking at Submariner that way, as far as developing the conformance test goes. So yeah, I definitely. So I pasted a link in the chat there to the current connectivity test, which shows some of the ways I used Ginkgo and a specific report to. If you scroll down to the bottom, the last test is the best one. So that one shows a label, which means it's optional. It gives a link to the spec. And the idea there is that the two by statements would be composable, maybe. Ultimately, that's the sort of thinking I had. What else did I have in mind there? So addressing Jack's comment, though, I think that's a really, really good point about the E2E tests, and it's something that they don't really address currently, because the deliverable of the MCS API project as a GitHub project and the SIG in terms of MCS itself isn't the reference implementation. I think we've all agreed on that, but it is the API. And so it would be interesting for the E2E tests to make sure that we're not doing something silly with the API, and that part is not addressed at all. So this could be things like, as we introduce V1 Alpha 2, for example, measure the difficulty of transitioning implementations from one to the other. It raises questions like, should the SIG provide webhooks an implementation of webhooks that other implementations can use directly, or do we just want to, I don't know, add E2E tests where, well, for example, a basic E2E test for that would be bring up the reference implementation with V1 alpha 1 objects and see what happens if you try to deserialize them as, well, unmarshal them as V1 alpha 2. And that's a part of that isn't addressed at all in E2E. I don't know if that's what you had in mind, Jack.
That certainly sounds like a super valuable thing to have, yeah, as we get to V1 alpha 2. So that would be, I think, added to that effort. Like we would want to see, basically, I think our job now prior to V1 alpha 2 is to prepare the end test surface area so that we can reasonably ask folks implementing V1 alpha 2 to do that kind of coverage.
Yeah.
And like, here's the sandbox. There's already a sandbox for you to play in. So
Yeah.
I would assume we're maybe almost there. So
Yeah. I just, yeah, want to plus one, what you just said about that, Stephen. Especially as like the API changes or we have like multiple versions, like what we are providing is this API. And yeah, I think that reemphasizes like, I really want to be careful as we are working on the end-to-end tests about like not sinking too much time into this reference implementation if it doesn't like serve the audience for the end-to-end tests or like our development. I think like we needed something to be able to run something to like, you know, do anything with, but it's like that is only intended to like serve us as far as to get like these basic end-to-end tests out and like give us something to like, you know, run API migrations against. And if we ever feel like that's getting out of control, like we don't want to be having like we have no desire to maintain like a productionable reference implementation. That's not our goal as a SIG.
Yeah, yeah. It's an API exerciser rather than a reference implementation.
Yeah, it's like a treadmill, not like a actual track.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
And then so going back to the conformance test. So yeah, so Paul in particular had fairly fancy ideas about a DSL and so on and what that should be like. My concern there, and this goes back to something you said, Jack, about having nicely readable code that uses Ginkgo semantics, but then having really complex invocations of Ginkgo to get the right things that are expected for the conformance tests. I'd like the conformance test as a whole to remain easily understandable. So I definitely see the value in sticking to to Ginkgo semantics, so that they can be composed using Ginkgo invocations. But I would like them to remain tractable. And I think the approach I would take is instead of trying to aim for the stars with a really complex, not necessarily complex, but a featureful DSL, is just start with the spec, figure out, and so there's a list somewhere, I think at the end of the document you're on, Laura, there. There's a list of the various features in the spec. So what I would like to see happen is go through them, implement tests for them, fairly basic tests, and whenever we see common patterns between tests, extract those as reusable functions, and then sort of work our way up from there instead of trying to come up with something really featureful that solves everything before we even start implementing anything and probably getting things wrong. Start by implementing tests, because any spec back test that we add to the conformance suite is going to be useful as soon as it's available, and then work our way up from there. As long as every single test that we add to the conformance suite has a link to the relevant section of the spec, then I think it will be beneficial for everyone. And that means that we can pull out small bits and work on small pieces at a time. which will help busy people coding it, but also busy people reviewing it and busy people using it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So it's small and yeah, is this the document that had at the bottom was a list of things that we might want to include like test? Can you scroll to the
Yeah.
bottom of this? Is this the one?
Laura, are
Well,
you
anyway,
still
I
with
mean,
us?
yeah, maybe also. But
I can share my screen instead. Let's see.
I think, I mean, the simplest one, I know you have two of them, and then one of them's optional though, the cluster set.local access.
Yeah, but I wanted to have
but-
an optional one just to test that side of the Ginkgo implementation.
Yeah, no, it's fine, it's fine. But I mean, the most basic thing, I mean, looking at the spec as well, I mean, a service export is created, there should be a service import created in the service namespace of every cluster. That's a very basic test. I don't know, basic one. And that is section, yeah, and that is the section on importing services. So we're trying to share.
Yeah, is it not working?
Oh, there it is. Oh no, yeah,
Right.
I think yeah, we're seeing it now.
So it's this. Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what I'm sharing.
I can see MCS API and cluster ID beta blockers status doc.
Yeah. Other unblocking work. That's the section on it.
It's not that then. It's weird.
Yeah, that's not the one.
Right.
I found it. Oh, you got it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
that's
think.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one.
And so essentially we'd worked our way through the spec, different sections of the spec, and written up what a conformance test would look like. But without considering scale at this point, number of clusters and so on. And so the goal was then to just get that working, well, typically with 2 clusters, and then worry about scaling it up afterwards. Some of them only make sense for, I think, 3. At least all the ones where you want to distinguish between the services available locally and not, those sorts of things. And then there were a couple of points as well where, don't know if you remember, Laura, but there were a couple of points where we thought maybe we needed to discuss things again in the SIG more broadly, because, for example, DNS is supposed to be optional.
Right.
And there's an awful lot of reliance on endpoint slices as well, which are also supposed to be optional.
Yeah. And the DNS being optional is also like, that's true in like Kubernetes too. So it's like kind of not. So that one was a little bit easier for us to hand wave, I think. The endpoint slices one, if we are depending on it for conformance, I think is an issue. Especially since like removing that was specifically like even a cloud provider kind of like, we don't need this thing because we can do it with our own like cool thing or whatever. And then the audience, the purpose of the conformance test is to make it easier for such like downstream implementations to confirm behavior.
Yeah.
But yeah, I
Yeah,
think the
and it should
DNS one we
really,
can wait around, but the endpoint one we can't depend on in the tests.
yeah.
Well, you could make it optional. I mean, it's optional. Make it optional in the test. I mean, it could be a CLI arg, you know, or something like that. But or wait a reasonable amount of time for an endpoint slice to be created, and if it is, then verify it that it's
Yeah.
correct. Something like that. But
Yeah. Yeah, we shouldn't fail the test if endpoint slices aren't present, but if they are
Right.
present, then they should match the spec.
right, exactly.
Stuff like this that is a pressure point, I guess, for the tests versus the standard, then we could talk about it in the SIG too some more. So I don't want to like shut that down.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So Laura, you said you'd write up test number 3, and John, you're going
Yeah.
to work on that. I can write up, so maybe not the rest of this week because I'm probably going to be on PTO, but I'll write up the test inventory section of the document as GitHub issues, and then we can, well, people can assign themselves. I think anybody can assign themselves to bug, or I can just comment on it and I can do that. That way we'll know who's working on what, and then there's the whole E2E tests as API, well, making sure that we're doing sensible things with the API. That needs more thought, I think. And then, of course, going through the spec again and making sure that we're actually testing everything that we should be testing.
Yeah, I think those last 2 points are maybe more of like a, you know, huddle with us or in like the SIG meeting generally, to make sure that we're covering that. But yeah, so I think that, and yeah, because I think especially like if we want to come up with some stuff that's like, what's an end-to-end test that tests the API migration, we kind of need to like define that and like decide like, do we write this in the cap or do we just like have some other place where we keep notes of like the tests we're supporting going forward, just in terms of like a process or policy thing to make sure that we're capturing that well. That's my take on those 2 points. I think most immediately, like me and John working on the test 3, and then I don't know exactly what we want our next like check-in point to be about the conformance test. If we're just like going and getting some familiarity, and then like circle back. If we like meeting in these off times together, if we like talking on chat, even that type of thing, I would like to know how we want to work together, at least for the next super short term. And then I think we did pretty well coming up with like an ad hoc, you know, let's meet today meeting. So I don't know if we need to do something super regular if we're down to like say hey to each other like this.
Let's be agile.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah, because there'll be times when we'll want to huddle, and other times where it won't be as useful. And yeah, I do think it's worth discussing the whole E2E test for API in the SIG, because we'll probably want to do the
Yeah.
same, something similar for about API and cluster properties.
Definitely. Yeah. Since we seem to be the SIG of APIs, like we should probably solve this problem for ourselves. That is a bit
Yeah.
like, yeah, I think it's a bigger question, but one that like we can draw from everybody. It's not just this group who's trying to work on this thing. Like this is the problem. The whole every project out of the SIG right now has, because we love making APIs. Okay, yeah, I think we should put that on the agenda for a future SIG-MC meeting for sure, and use our experience of talking about this here to jumpstart that convo for all the projects.
Yep.
Yeah, I've already got familiar with the conformance test suite. Steve and I talked last week.
Cool.
I've already pushed couple PRs, and one got merged, but the other one I changed the report format to HTML. So that's Steve and I already reviewed it. So
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and I can start working on. I mean, there's one probably basic one, as I mentioned before. So it's listed second bullet there, exporting a service export, result in the creation of a service import. Very basic thing. I can immediately start working on that if folks are okay with that.
Yeah.
I am
I've
okay.
already done this actually in Submariner a lot of.
Yeah.
Right.
I wrote an extensive unit test for the Submariner implementation. So a lot of the stuff I've already done.
Cool. Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely go for it. That sounds cool. Looking forward to seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something else. I didn't mention when I was talking about Submariner earlier, but Submariner has a fairly extensive E2E test suite that covers a lot of all this stuff. So that Tom wrote.
Unit tests, yeah, unit
Yeah.
tests, very extensive and end-to-end.
Yeah, if we can integrate that knowledge out so that, you know, it's useful to all participating or potential implementations, that would be sweet.
Yep. And if we make enough progress, then maybe we can have who's all going to KubeCon in November?
I probably am. Pretty sure.
Right. So yeah, maybe we could have a session at the Contributor Summit on writing conformance tests and writing tests for APIs.
Yeah,
You're
definitely.
going to stir the audience into a frenzy of excitement with that subject matter.
I know, they'll be frothing.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, then let's do those things, and then probably expect to talk about the bigger API testing, you know, thoughts and lifestyles in the SIG generally going forward, and then
We've lost you again, Laura.
Nicely timed.
yeah.
It was a cliffhanger. I think you're back.
Is she up in the mountains or something, or is she? I assume she lives in Washington, right? Yeah.
I spent a lot of money yesterday upgrading my Wi-Fi mesh. It suddenly broke on me.
Yeah.
So I spent.
Yeah. So sometime between now and KubeCon, let us meet again. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
In any case, I can't remember when I think it's sometime in September, probably later than that, the CFP for the Contributor Summit closes. But yeah.
I think at least one of us will be around next Tuesday so we can summarize our discussion here for the larger SIG. I'm on PTO. If Stephen, if you're on PTO,
Yeah, I'll
maybe.
be there. No, I'll be.
Okay, cool.
I'll be there. I'll be
Cool.
on.
I'll be out
on the
next week.
call.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Laura, thanks for organizing.
See you.